Hi, I'm Michael McFadden. I'm a Wildlife Conservation Officer here at Taronga Zoo, Sydney, where I focus mostly on reptiles and amphibians and threatened species. Today, at the moment, we're in our Northern Corroboree Frog Conservation Facility. Here we look after one of Australia's most iconic frog species, the Northern Corroboree Frog. It's a critically endangered species. It's only found in Australia. It's only found in a very small portion of Australia in the mountains at our highest elevations. And this species, unfortunately, is down to less than a couple of thousand left in the wild and relies on conservation facilities like this one right here for its continual existence. Here in this facility, at the moment, we have about 600 Northern Corroboree frogs, which is about maybe between half and a third of what's left in the wild. So here we capture a great proportion of the genetics of this species here in this facility. So the species we have here in this facility is the Northern Corroboree frog. It has a closely related cousin, the Southern Corroboree frog. They both look pretty similar. They have similar kind of patterns, but you'll see on this frog here, the yellow is a little bit more kind of towards lime green. It's got a bit of green in the yellow. The Southern Corroboree frog, on the other hand, has a bright yellow coloration. So they're very similar frogs. They only look a little bit different. They both occupy the same kind of habitats, and they're both impacted by Chytrid fungus the same, unfortunately. In the wild, the Northern Corroboree frog's down to the last couple of thousand individuals. The Southern Corroboree frog is even more at risk. The Southern Corroboree frog, at the moment, the only sites it occurs at in the wild is our reintroduction sites. So the species would actually be extinct without the conservation breeding programs being utilised to supplement wild populations and also to release frogs with our partners, our New South Wales threatened species officers, into disease-free enclosures down in Kosciuszko National Park. In the wild, this species occupies habitat at high elevations. So some of our more higher elevation sites in Australia. This species is found up at elevations that are between usually about 1,000 and 700 metres elevation. So in Australia, that's some of our highest peaks. Australia is a pretty flat country, but at those elevations, that's where we get snow throughout the winter months. And this species is actually found during the winter months, is found under the snow. They chill right down, and this facility here, being an insulated facility with refrigeration on it, we drop this facility down to about 4 degrees Celsius during the winter months, which means effectively this facility becomes a fridge. It's actually like a big walk-in fridge. The frogs bunker down. They won't eat for that whole period. They won't eat for about 3 months. They disappear into the moss, and then they come back up again as soon as we start turning the temperatures up, and that's when they start feeding again. Now, the reason that this species is endangered in the wild, there's a few different reasons. The primary one driving this species towards extinction is a disease. It's called Chytrid fungus. It's a disease that's present in Australia. It's present in the Americas. It's actually spread all around the world, and it's wiped out about, we think, between at least 50 species. It's caused the extinction of, and there's hundreds of species that it's impacted on greatly. And unfortunately, for this species, the Northern Corroboree frog, they have very little resistance to the disease. So when they get it, they get quite sick. Their little hearts stop beating because of the electrolyte balance in their system. So their sodium and potassium levels drop, their hearts stop beating, and unfortunately they die. For the Northern Corroboree frogs, there's a couple of other threats too. One you may have very well heard of in the past is climate change. For this species, they lay their eggs in little moist terrestrial nests, so moist nests on land, not actually in the water. And they rely on the early snowmelt or autumn rains to flood those nests. In dry years, when it's dry and hot, unfortunately those waters don't come, so often the eggs or the tadpoles dry up and die. So these days we're getting more and more extremes, extreme droughts and extreme flooding, and unfortunately for this species, during those years, sometimes no eggs get through tadpole stage to metamorphosis. So climate change is another threat to the species, and there's other things too, like introduced species such as deer and horses, pigs, there's invasive weeds, but disease and climate change are two of the big factors for this species. And unfortunately, with increasing fires, the bushfires that we had in Australia back in 2019-2020 is one of the reasons we actually built this facility. When the bushfires happened, the remaining populations of the Northern Corroboree frog were under severe threat. About 70% of the remaining, so 7 out of every 10 populations remaining of this species got impacted by the bushfires. Hence, we got funding to build this facility. We started up setting up more of an insurance colony for this species. And now we're in a position where we've got a really broad genetic range of this species, and we're able to breed them here at the zoo for reintroductions back to the wild to try to bolster wild populations and get this species surviving and breeding on its own again. Now, if we look around this facility, there's a few different things you'll see. You'll see lots of these little containers, and every one of these little containers is full of frogs. And in some of these containers, like the one I'm opening right now, in this little container, you can see 4 little frogs in there. Those frogs in there are 20 years of age. So these ones were bred at the start of 2005. So they're 20 years old. This species can live for some time. They can live for, well, I guess, as far as we know, at least 20 years in the wild. 20 years at the zoo, sorry. In the wild, we know they live for about 9 or 10 years. But here at the zoo, frogs that are over 20 years old are actually still living and breeding now and still nice and healthy. So in the absence of disease, with lots of food available, with the best care that they receive here at the zoo, they're able to live and thrive to a much later age. So in all the middle tanks you see behind me here, there's about 50 to 70 tadpoles in each of those, and they're ones we're rearing through. They're ones that were bred here at the zoo, and we're rearing them up for reintroduction back to the wild. In the top and the bottom tanks are ones where we've collected eggs from different sites in the wild. We're actually rearing them here to contribute towards the insurance population. So all of the insurance population here at the zoo comes from eggs that were collected from the wild initially. We've never actually collected frogs, we've just taken a small proportion of eggs from different nests from throughout the range to closely genetically manage the species and make sure we've got a really broad mix. For a species that's on the brink of extinction, the more genetic diversity you have in the population means the more options they've got to evolve and adapt long term. They'll be able to produce resistance for disease on their own. They'll be able to adapt to changes in the climate and so forth long term. So we have a good genetic range. Here in these middle tanks, the tadpoles that you see in the image, these are the ones here were bred at the zoo, and we're rearing them up to metamorphosis. You can even see one of those little ones in the back there. He's actually developed his front and his little back legs, so he'll come out of that tank over the next day or two. And then these little ones will be reared up to about 1 year of age, and we'll reintroduce them back to the wild. We do have an active reintroduction program for this species. We've done everything in an experimental fashion. So we've done releases of different life stages, so of eggs, of juvenile frogs, of adult frogs, just to determine what technique works the best. We've also released them in different seasons, so we've released some frogs in spring and some frogs in autumn, just to determine what frogs survive better. And every time we release these frogs, the frogs with their colourful pattern that you'll see in the images and the footage of them, they've got beautiful yellow and black stripes, and their belly's got yellow and black blotches, but each one's like a fingerprint. So each frog is individually, we're able to tell them apart. So of all the 600 frogs in this facility, we're able to tell them all apart quite readily by their pattern. So when we release these frogs to the wild, we take photos of their back and their belly, and then years later, when I find them on the nest in the wild, when we're doing our monitoring, I can actually work out, this one was from the spring release of 2014, or this one was from an adult release in 2020. And that allows us to fine-tune the technique to make sure we get the best reintroduction, the best survival from reintroduction as we can, to give this species the best chance of surviving in the wild long term that we can. So in these little tanks, we've been pulling out the little tadpoles as they develop their front legs. At that stage, they're going through metamorphosis. And when they go through metamorphosis, the tadpole fully physically changes into a frog. It develops legs, it loses its gills and develops lungs, it loses its suctorial kind of mouth part disc and develops an actual carnivorous little mouth. Its whole digestive system changes from a long vegetarian digestive system into a short carnivorous gut. So they go through that process of change. But in that process, they need to be able to climb out of the water. So we put them in these little tanks, and then over the next kind of 4 or 5 days after they develop their front legs, they'll climb out into the gravel and up into the moss. And there they'll go through their full stage to metamorphosis, and then after that point, they'll be transferred to one of our little terrestrial tanks where we'll start feeding them up, and they'll go on their growth journey. At metamorphosis, this frog is only about 0.15 of a gram, so they're a tiny little frog. They fit on your finger, on the back of your little finger's fingernail. They're a tiny little frog when they first metamorphose, and we have to feed them tiny little day-old crickets for them to eat because they're that small at that stage. And then it'll take them at least 2 or 3 years before they're at a stage where they're big enough and old enough to actually start breeding and producing eggs of their own. So here at Taronga Zoo, we're a not-for-profit organisation where our main focus is on conservation. We have a whole range of recovery programs that we participate in. We fund different conservation programs around the world. And just here in the department that I'm focusing on at the moment, the reptile and amphibian department, we have 7 different conservation programs for species that are on the brink of extinction, some species that are extinct in the wild, and others that are critically endangered and down to their last frogs. For some of the species we work with, there's one in particular here at the zoo, the yellow-spotted bell frog, which at the moment only exist here at Taronga Zoo. We're breeding them up at the moment for reintroduction to the wild. We have other species like the Bellinger river turtle that crashed really heavily in 2015 due to a new disease. We set up an insurance population, and we have individuals of those eggs being laid and hatchlings hatching out as we speak, which are going to help save the species. And even on Christmas Island, which is an island off to the north of Australia where 2 species of lizard are extinct in the wild, we've got them in here at the zoo, as well as a breeding population on the island, and we're breeding those up for translocation and try to bring those species back from the brink. So here at Taronga Zoo, our main focus is conservation, and one of our main focuses is focusing on those species that are right on the brink and needing human intervention to get past. Without the breeding programs that you see, unfortunately, some of these species will be lost forever.